All right, hi everyone. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. This week's webinar, I am going to show you how to use container controls in web apps. And I have 5 example projects we're going to run through, and it should take most of the time, so we're just going to jump right into it. I will remind everyone while I'm getting Xojo up here that if you have questions while I'm talking, just type them into the question window. They'll pop up on my other screen, and I'll try to address them as I'm working through the examples. So last week I covered desktop container controls, which are incredibly useful. And web has an equivalent control, also incredibly useful. So let's open up the first project here and take a quick peek at it. If I open the right one, I want to open first, which is, oh, hang on, let me switch back to Finder. I don't know if that's the one I wanted or not. I have too many projects. It's too hard to find everything. Let's try this one. All right, I want to start with the simpler ones and work my way up to more complicated ones to help flow this along. All right, so here we're looking at one of the simplest container control examples, and this is included in the examples that ship with Xojo. And just like with desktop, container controls are added right here from the insert button or menu, and you just pick container control. And a container control appears on in your navigator as a control. And you can see here, this is a web page, and it has on it 3 containers. There's one right here, and this is an instance of the today container, which is down here. Put a second instance on it of the container on here, so you can see that they're completely independent from each other. And then this big thing at the bottom is another container that is put on here to intentionally show off the scroller, because the container contents are actually too big to fit in what's here on the screen. So on web projects, you can automatically add a scroll bar, so you can scroll through the contents of the container. Again, very useful. So let's just run this project so you can see what it looks like. That should come up in Safari. Great. So you can see it looks pretty similar to what was in the layout editor. And I can click the button here that was on the container, and there's just a line of code that fills in the current date right there. Same thing here. You can type and change. The things are completely independent. And you can see the container here. I can scroll down all the way to the bottom until I get to the buttons that are on the container. Now, this particular example doesn't actually do anything, but it does show you how containers can be used and laid out. So let's get back to Xojo. So to create this particular web page, all you have to do is drag the containers onto it. So you just find them, you select the page you want, you find them in the navigator, and then you just drag it over here. And you can have another container right on your web page. Easy as that. I'll remove that one. This particular one you might remember when we clicked the Today button, filled in the current date. Well, you can see on the web page, there's not actually any code anywhere. And that's because this code is encapsulated in the container. You'll see when I click on the web page, the entire container gets selected. I can't select the button individually. I can't select the text field individually because those are on the container themselves. Other objects that are on the web page I can select, but the container is considered its own object. You can't select the stuff within it. So to do that, you just go to the container, and then you can see its layout. And containers are laid out just like a web page would be. You drag the controls you want onto them. And this one has a text field and a button. And you'll see now I can, of course, select them individually. And if we look at the button, we can see this is where the code is on the action event to do the assignment of the date to the button, or to the text field, sorry. So very simple here, but this starts to show you how container controls allow you to essentially better organize your user interface layouts. Particularly this little thing here, I mean, it's not well defined yet, but this could be the beginnings of your own date control. You could, put validations on here to make sure that a date is entered that matches what you expect. You could have a button here that fills in the current date or anything else that your app might need. And then you could reuse that throughout your web application just by dragging the container onto the page when needed. And you don't have to re-implement that or, copy and paste controls from web page to web page or any of that stuff. You just reuse the container. And the other example of a container is, this ability to scroll. Because if we look here at the license agreement container, you can see it's pretty large. It's a big container, got a big header, lots of text, a couple buttons at the bottom. They don't actually do anything, but it's a pretty big thing. And putting it here on the window or in the web page, sorry, it's not enough room for all of it, so it's smaller. And we have right here the behavior property, scroll bar is visible. It's set to automatic, which means it will show them if necessary. And if necessary means if the content's bigger than what there is room to display. You can also choose to always show the scroll bar or to completely turn it off so it never appears. Automatic's the default and probably the most common setting you're going to want. We'll look at some other examples later of how you can make a new container that really takes advantage of the scroll bars among all of the other things that it can do. So let's see if there's anything else here on this particular one I want to point out. But like I said, this is just the high-level overview of, how a container is done, how you lay it out, nothing terribly sophisticated going on here. But you definitely want to, take this and play around with it, and add new things or do whatnot. But let's jump into some of the cool ones. So let's close this one here. And what is this one? This is our dynamic example. Is one thing you can do with containers is that they can be added dynamically at runtime. And the good news about that is that, it allows you to add controls to the window at runtime. So let's run this here so you can see what I mean. So this particular project is set up with some add buttons on the left, some delete buttons on the right, and clicking a button is going to add a container here in the middle, so you can see that. And again, it's just reusing this very simple container here that plugs in the current date. And you can choose to add up to 3 with this particular layout. We can go back and remove one, add it back. I can hit the clear dates button. It'll go through and clear the dates for all of them if they all had values. This is all done completely at runtime. There's no actual container on this web page, which we'll look at in a moment. The container is added when you click the add button. So let's see how that works. So I just double clicked on that to show the code. And you can see right here, it's just checking if the first container is empty. And if it is, or if it's nil, meaning we haven't declared one yet, it's creating a new one, and it's using this command right here. Again, this is the same command that you would have saw if you were at the desktop container control webinar, is it's embed within. And that tells the container to embed itself. And where does it embed itself? Well, we're actually embedding it here on the page. That's why we're using self. And then you specify the coordinates. And then we're keeping these in an array so that we can reference them later. And that's used by the delete buttons so that they can be removed from the web page. And you'll see here, if we look at the corresponding code in the delete button, we're checking that there's actually is a container in the first one. And if there is, we're closing it, and then we're clearing it out. And that's how that works. You click the add button, creates the container, embeds it on the page, adds it to the array. The delete button closes the container and then removes it or nils it out from the array so that the add will work again next time. The other thing that's on here is the clear dates button. And you can see this is just looping through the array that we've created. And if the value is not nil in there, it calls the clear method on it. Now the clear method is a method that's been added to the container itself. So let's take a look at that container. And you can see this looked familiar. Same control text field, a button that fills in the current date, but it also has a method called clear, surprisingly enough. And it doesn't do anything sophisticated, but it's an example of essentially an API that you can create for your container to allow it to do something specific. So in this particular case, we've created a method called clear, and it is clearing the text field. Now, this is much better than attempting in the, if I go back to the clear dates button, this would be much better than trying to attempt to do something along the lines of d dot, what would be the name of that control? Let's expand it down here in the navigator so we can see the name. Date field dot text equals this. You could theoretically do this to clear that text field. But this isn't as great a design because your container, you're all of a sudden, assuming information about the container, or assuming that the date is displayed in a date field, in a text field. We're assuming it happens to be called date field. And then we're accessing the text property directly on that. And that all works, but it's not the world's greatest design. What if you needed to change the user interface for that to, for some reason, to be a text area? Or you wanted to use a completely different control under there that wasn't a text field. Maybe you had, and granted, these are simple controls, so there's not as many fake examples as I can dream up. But there could be cases where you'd want to redesign that. Maybe you just want to simply rename that field because you don't like the name date field. Or maybe you foolishly didn't give it a good name to start with, so this was called text field 1. And then you decide, oh, text field 1, it's terrible. Well, you're going to break a bunch of code as soon as you change the container if your code is referencing things like this. But by calling it in the method, I can change whatever the heck I want down here on the container. And all I need to do is update the container itself. So I would just go into my method and fix it in one place. And then everywhere else in my project that references it wouldn't even know about the change. It would just continue to work. So those are things to think about with containers, is you can really build a nice, clean design that allows your code to be reused and be safe, essentially. This is and using containers to add controls at runtime is the supported way to add controls at runtime. When you're dealing with desktop apps, there are two ways to do that. One way is to use what's called control sets, and you can use control sets to add new controls to a window. But with web projects, you really just want to stick to using container controls. There are a couple other techniques that allow you to add individual controls to windows, but they're not supported, and it's best if you stay away from them. But using a container control works great. All right, let's move on to another project here that allows you to simulate a tab panel. This project is also included with Xojo, and let's run it so you can see what it looks like. If you've been creating web apps, you've known with Xojo, there's no built-in control for doing tabs or even page panels for switching between sets of controls easily. But you can simulate that by using container controls. And you can see here, I click this, well, tab 2 selected, here are the controls for it that appeared. I can click in the text area and type stuff. I can click back to the first one, click the buttons, do whatever. And it looks, for all intents and purposes, as if there is a tab control that you can use. But the reality is this is a few separate controls on here. But this is made much, much simpler by using a container control. So let's see what that looks like. All right, here you're looking at the main page, which is a little big, so I might just resize. I guess I can't resize it too much since the locking's not set. But we'll make it a little smaller. There we go. So this is just some explanation text. That's just a label, nothing to get too excited about. This control right here that's letting you switch between the tabs is actually a segmented control. And you can see that right here. And you see it has 2 segments specified, and they have their names. And you can click that to click on each one to change the names and the properties. But you see when I click it, that's the only thing that's selected. It didn't select anything down here. And what is down here is a rectangle to simulate the area, the tab area essentially. And then within that are the various containers. And there's one for each tab. So when I click on this one, this would be tab 1. You can see that it has the name first tab, and it's the first tab container, which we'll look at in a moment. Now, unfortunately, because we're simulating this, I can't actually click here on second because this is this segment here. You can't click on the individual segments. I can't click here to see what the second tab would be. But that's easy enough with the navigator. You just find it right here and click on it. And did it show? Oh wait, it's not going to show because of the Z order. So you do have to stack your things. I forgot about that. So I'll move that one out of the way. So there now you can see tab 2 here, which is the other container, second tab container. So essentially, because you have to stack everything, that's a bit of a pain. And certainly wouldn't work if you're dealing with a bunch of individual controls, because you'd constantly be having to slide stuff in and out of the way to be able to click on things to edit them, and you would probably go a little bit crazy. But by just stacking the containers, you really only have to do that once, and you don't have to worry about it again. And when you need to edit the containers, you just click on them, and you edit the containers. And then these are just as if you were editing a web page. You just drag and drop the controls you want on here, same as you would for any other layout. And we'll look at second tab here, text area and a label. So all your editing ends up happening in here, and the web page itself doesn't have, a bazillion different controls on it that you have to figure out how to manage or show and hide depending on what fake tab is selected or whatnot. You're just dealing with big container blobs. Looking here at the questions, I see we got a few comments about sound coming on and off. I hope that's not a big problem. We'll have to check that out on the recording after. Can you dynamically add controls to a container control? Yes, absolutely. You can add container controls to almost anything, but you can specifically add them to web pages and to other containers as well. Yes. So if you go back to the main page here and we click on the segmented control, we can see it has a little bit of code and nothing terribly sophisticated again, but it's just checking which segment is selected. And if the first segment is selected, it's making the first tab visible and the second tab invisible. And if the first segment is not selected, then it's hiding the first tab and showing the second tab. And this is all pretty easy with just having 2 tabs. You'd obviously have to, make sure you hide every other tab if you've had a bunch of tabs, or even, if you had a bunch of tabs, you'd want to, loop through and essentially show only the one that was selected and then hide everything else. But that's all the code that you see on here. There's not really any other code to speak of, I don't think. No, we're looking at everything right here in the navigator. There's nothing left to expand. So this entire tab panel is simulated just by, essentially proper layout of your containers and the use of a segment to switch things around. So that can be pretty handy and also shows off another way that you can start to use containers to give your web app some pretty neat little UI tweaks. So let me just check how we're doing on time and what I got left for projects here. Okay, great. So before we move into what our next project is, which is going to be a sample of a little control, I'm going to start our regularly scheduled poll. And let's see here, launch poll. So if you can just take a quick moment to fill out this very short little poll for our marketing folks that love data such as this, I will get the next project prepped. No, I'm sorry. Legacy key means a non-Xojo key, so a real basic or real studio key. That was a question here on the question list. And another question that popped up here, what was the purpose of the first pragma line? Oh, that was in the other project. I can jump back to that and answer that quickly. Just refresh myself as to where that was. That was on the segmented control. All right, great. That looks like everyone's done the poll. I can close that. We can get back to the fun stuff. So there was a question about how this pragma line is used. And Xojo has all kinds of pragmas for various things. This particular pragma right here, this is the name of the pragma, is unused. And it's just saying that we're not using this parameter that's up here in the event handler. And the only reason for this is if you happen to be running Analyze Project. Actually, I can comment this out. You can see you get a warning that says there's a parameter here that you didn't use. Well, if you're one of those people, and it turns out that there's a fair amount of programmers that are these types of people where you're a little obsessive and don't like to see warnings, you can put a pragma in that says, I know I'm not using that parameter, but it's intentional. I don't really need it in this particular method. So you can put this pragma here, and then if you do the Analyze project again, no warnings, and everybody's happy. So that's what that's for. So let's take a look at this example. Web projects have access to all kinds of controls, many of them very similar to desktop controls. But web projects do not have a combo box control like a desktop has. There is a pop-up menu, there is a text field, but there's no combo box. So let's make our own. Let's run this so you can see how this works. So you can see here, this is essentially a combination of a pop-up menu and a text field that attempts to work similarly to how a combo box might work. So you can see I can click this, I can get drop downs to some values. I can type, and it'll attempt to autocomplete based on what's in the drop-down list. Or you can just pick something else. So nothing too sophisticated there either, but it's pretty neat to show how you can combine two different controls to kind of make up your own control that you might find useful in your web apps. Let's take a look at how that works. We'll click on the container, which I happen to just call Web Combo Box. And you see it's shrunk down a little bit, and right here on there is a text field. And if I can click right here, there's a combo box or pop-up menu, sorry. So text field and a pop-up menu. And essentially the text field is layered on top of the pop-up menu with a higher order so that it looks like the pop-up menu is only there for the little drop-down controller. And you can see on the text field itself in the text changed event, and in web apps, the text change event is not called immediately after every character like it is on desktop projects. And this is important to just think about, because if it were called after every character, that would generate an awful lot of network traffic between your app running on the browser and the web app running on the server, as each keystroke would have to be sent back and forth, and there could be latency and delays. So what the text change event does is wait a moment. If the typing stops, then it sends that information off. So this autocomplete actually fills in more like a moment after you stop typing. But here you can see that essentially, after a little bit of checking to make sure something was typed, and we've actually enabled the autocomplete feature, which is set up as a property here so it can be turned on and off. It just loops through the values that are in the pop-up menu, and if it finds one that starts with what was typed, it sets the text to it and sets the current row to it. And that's a neat little thing too. Again, it's attempting to simulate how the combo box works here, but you can see if I type in that and then Vermont fills in, and then I click on the thing, you can see, well, Vermont is selected. Well, that's handy. So that's what that code is doing. The selection changed event on the pop-up menu itself is simply setting the focus back to the text field and then setting the text to be whatever happened to be selected in the pop-up menu. So that's all pretty simple. All right, and the open event handler just has a make sure the focus is set in the right spot. Again, because this is a container control, and the way we want it to work is we want when this particular thing's open, the user's cursor to be in the text field and blinking so they can start typing. So that's what that does. And then this goes back to some of the API stuff that we talked about earlier. Is there's two methods on here called add row and delete all row, and they just map directly to the combo box. I'm sorry, again, I keep saying the combo box when I really mean, the behind the scenes pop-up menu. But they're used to add and remove rows from the pop-up menu that's behind the scenes. And you can see that that's all they're doing is directly calling the equivalent method on the pop-up menu. But again, that's important to essentially hide that, because you don't want people directly accessing the individual controls you've used to build your container. That exposes just too many implementation details about how it works, and it makes your code more fragile. So you don't want to do that. The other thing that's on here is the autocomplete property, a simple Boolean, and this is used to turn the autocomplete on and off. When I think you might see this, maybe if I click here, it might be turned on by default. Oh, maybe I have it here. Yeah, here we go. So you can see in the open event handler, I have a few lines of code to just add some default data to the menu, and then I turn on the autocomplete feature. All really easy, but there you go. You get a container that provides you with a new control that you can use throughout your own web projects. And as you're going to see, I mean, that's a primary use of containers, is creating well-defined, reusable things that you can use in, throughout one project in multiple places. This would be an example of that, I suppose. Or even, scattered amongst all your web projects. And this could also be an example of that. It might even be a class you make sure is included in every one of your web projects because you find it useful. I believe, yeah, and this particular project is not yet in Xojo, but will be included in Xojo with release 3. All right, let's plug ahead to the next project, because as we get to each of these, they get a little bit more complicated. All right, this is a Navigator project. And this is a common need with web applications, is you need something that allows the user that's running the web application to know where they are in the application. So this particular thing is a container that sits at the top of this particular page. And you can see as I click on an individual section, the page is changed, and the section I clicked on becomes highlighted. You can change the background color, change it back. So you're starting to see how you can really use containers to provide even more control over your user interface and start to get some really specific things. This particular one has a background. It changes the bold when you select the thing. It's also changing the background color when you tweak this. So let's see how this is implemented. Well, first there's pages for each one of the areas: home, contacts, messages, and settings. So we have home, contacts, messages, and settings pages. And these just contain, dummy information at this moment, just to show that the page actually changed. And the settings page actually contains the checkbox that allows us to tweak the background. The Navigator itself is in this Navigator Stuff folder. I will expand that. And what I have in here is the container itself and several styles that are used to control um, what the selected section looks like, what the non-selected ones look like, and the background color. So that's what those three are for. And you can see, looking at this particular thing, this is implemented simply as a bunch of labels. Actually, 4 labels on here. Nothing. I originally thought, well, I might want to do this using a toolbar. And then I decided that, well, yeah, toolbar is kind of cool, but had some clicking stuff that didn't allow me to keep stuff selected quite the way I wanted. And a few other things, there's option to show an icon. I'm like, well, I don't really need an icon, so I'd have to turn all those off. So I got about halfway through, and then I said, you know what, I'm going to switch this to just labels. Well, because this was a container and I had most of this, everything was hidden as far as implementation details, the code I had already put in all of these pages to determine what was the selected section and other stuff didn't really change at all. And that again, I could go back and change all of these things. Just say I didn't want to use these as labels. Say they need to be web canvases for some reason, because I actually wanted to draw icons here instead, or a combination or whatever. I could change all this, and the pages themselves just aren't going to care as long as you're using the same API. So you can see on each of the labels, they have a little bit of code in the mouse down. And it simply shows the page that matches their name. You click the home label. Well, you want to show the home page. So we're doing that. So that's all of each of the labels have for code on them. But there's a couple, one method, that's right, one method. And the select item method indicates which one of these is actually selected, and we'll show it in bold. So you call it and you send in the name of whichever section you want to select, and it changes the style to be the navigator label selected style. And if we grab that one right here, you can see this particular style is laid out to have, well, first of all, it's set up as centered. The font is bolded. And then I tweaked the background color of it to just a grayish. So then and we run that again, you'll see that when you click on one, you can see it's bolded and it has a kind of a darker gray background. And as you click on each one, that's what it gets for the style. So that's how it changes. And the normal style, the only thing this specifies is just that it should be centered. So that's what you're looking at for code that's on this particular thing. If you go back to the pages, each of the navigator controls that were added to the top of the pages, and they would just lock to the top and lock to the left and right, so they you can see the locking over here, so that they'll grow and shrink with the web page. The height was set to match so that they're nice and tiny. On the open event handler, we select the one that matches whatever page we are. So the home page is selecting home, the contacts page will select contacts, etc. And the shown event handler, which is called when the actual page appears in the browser, checks to see which background it should use. And we didn't look at that, but we have to jump ahead to the settings page, because this has the checkbox. And the checkbox has on it a simple little bit of code that sets a session property to be either true or false, depending on what the checkbox is, checked or not checked. And we set this as a session property so that individual people that are connecting can have their own individual setting for the background. We certainly wouldn't be the best thing to have, where if I happen to like the white background and I check to turn on the white background, and then every other user that connects to the web app then sees a white background. You want it to be individual per user. So you put it in the session. So we're setting the session, and then the code after this just immediately sets the background for the current page. But what we do here is we check the session property whenever any of the pages reload and say, hey, do we need to change the background? And if it was said to be white, we use the white background style. Otherwise, we just nil it out and it uses whatever the browser background is. And that's what allows the background to be changed and then immediately available. And you can see the same event handlers are on each of these pages. They do the same thing. The same container is on each of the pages. So this starts to give you a very consistent look and feel. If you're building a web app, that's pretty important. You're going to want the web app to have a consistent way to navigate between all the pages and everything. So this gives you a navigator you put at the top. It gives you easy access to all your pages, shows you clearly which page you're on. I'm sure you've all seen web apps that have something like that. They also often will have a sidebar or something to do that sort of navigation instead of at the top, or maybe even in addition to what you have at the top. And again, containers are great ways to implement that sort of thing. I often get questions from people asking if Xojo can handle sort of templates for setting up pages so they have this stuff. And it doesn't have a template web page per se where you pre-fill all this in, but by using containers, you pretty much are creating a template. You're creating a template, the components of your template, and you're just putting the template components on each of your pages right where they belong. And then you don't have to worry about those things as you're designing your web app. All right, if there's no questions on this one, we're going to move on to the last example, which shows you how to create your own grid control with a pop-up menu in it. So let's run this one so you can see what it's doing. So let's pick number of rows to add to the grid. We'll pick a number like 40. All right, so we just added 40 rows to our grid. It's scrollable because we added more rows than what can appear on the size of the container itself. Each of these is a text field that you can type in. It's hooked up to events, so when I type the text here, the event was called that allowed the little label here to update to say which row you changed and what the new text was. The pop-ups each have values that can be assigned. And when you click one, it also calls an event that allows you to see what the value was changed to. And this, of course, could be extended. This is like a lot of these examples, they're simplified to kind of get the point across, but they're easily extended to do things that are probably more practical for the real applications that you're creating. So this has just two fields, the text field and the pop-up menu. But you can add whatever you want here. There could be multiple text fields. You could have other controls in this grid. So let's see what that all looks like. It's got some levels of containers that are interesting to see. So at the lowest level, you have a simple container for the pop-up menu itself, another one for the text field, and you can see these are just tiny containers that just encapsulate, those controls and nothing else. There's code back there that we'll look at as well, but from a UI standpoint, that's all that's on these particular containers. The web grid container is itself just a blank container. And what's going to happen, and this is showing an example, I think, of a question that was asked earlier. These two containers down here, the pop-up menu and the text field containers, are actually embedded into this web grid container at runtime, depending on the number of rows you want to add. What you add to your page is the web grid container. You don't add the text field or the pop-up menu containers. Those are all handled by the web grid container. So this is an example of essentially nested containers where you're adding containers onto a container. So that's the overall structure. You can see to get there, it takes a little bit of code. So let's expand some of the stuff here. The again, going back to the API thing that I've talked about, there's a couple rows added, sorry, a couple methods added to add a row to the pop-up and to get a value for the pop-up. The pop-up itself has an event handler for when you pick something. So when you change what's selected in the pop-up. So what we're doing here is we're just immediately raising an event. And we've called the event the same name, and you can see it's declared right here as an event definition. And it could be called anything. But this allows, if we go to the WebGrid container, you can, oh, sorry, that's hooked up with an add handler, not on here. So we'll look at the code in a moment. But it'll allow us on the WebGrid container to catch this event so that we can do something with it. So otherwise, we wouldn't be able to grab this event because it's buried in the container, and we wouldn't have access to it from this container. Similarly, on the text field container, it has the same sort of setup. The important event we care about for the text field is when the text itself is changed, and that's the text changed event of the text field. So we're having that raise an event on the container itself, which we also call text changed, so that event handler becomes available to the WebGrid container. So that's overall structure. If we had other event handlers that we cared about on these particular things, we would do the same technique. We would add the event handlers here so that we can put our own code in them, and then we would pass them off to our own event definitions, more than likely. It could be that you need to consolidate events or you want to implement them differently, and then you would handle that however you want. But this is the general technique. Now going to the WebGrid container, see if I can remember how this all works. There are several methods here for adding values to the pop-up, for getting and setting text in the text fields, and then some properties to track what's added, how many pop-ups and how many text fields are added to the grid at runtime. So looking at the simplest one, you can see there's a row count property on here that just returns the number of rows here. But when you set the number of rows, well, it has to essentially prepare the container. So this is where it's doing a bunch of work. It's creating new instances of the text or pop-up containers, adding them to the WebGrid container at the appropriate positions. And then the other thing that it's doing, so it's creating the new container, it's embedding it at the appropriate position, and then it's hooking up those event handlers that we added so that we can process them. So here it's hooking up, you can see we just added a text field here. So it's hooking up the text field's text change event handler, which is this one right here. And it's saying when that thing gets called, pass it off to the text change method that exists on this container. And that is this right here. So that's all this rather advanced statement is saying. So whenever this particular text change event is called, it gets passed through and eventually ends up at this method here. This method's purpose in life is to figure out which one of that array of text fields that's on the container was the one whose text actually changed. So it loops through all of them, checking each one to see if it's the one that was actually called, and there's a parameter passed in that is the instance of the one that was actually called. Once it finds it, it passes along yet another event, including the row of the one that was called. And this finally is what becomes available on the main page, on the container that you added to your web page. So you can see here when we expand the WebGrid, you can see it has two event handlers here that were added. And text changed is the one that finally made it back to where we care about, which is our web page itself, because all this other stuff is essentially API code behind the scenes. And then finally, when it gets called here, it's passing in the row of what changed so that you know which row is the one that actually changed. It allowed me to display that message. And then it's also referring to the method on there to get the text of a specific row. So starting back at the bottom, you have, in this particular case, the text field container, which is processing events for the text field that lives there. Those get passed along to the web grid container, which hooks everything up to its own event handlers, which then get passed along to the instance of the web grid that's sitting on the web page in the form of these two. In this particular case, this one, but the pop-up works pretty much exactly the same. So down from 1 up to number 2, up here to 3. So you kind of get 3 levels of message passing, if you will. Now you might be looking at this if you haven't designed anything like this in the past and say, oh boy, that's a lot of work. And it might be a little bit of work to set everything up the first time, but the benefit of this is that when you start to use this and you're just using it, you don't have to go back to any of this other code. Is when the design becomes much more useful and appreciated, because you just now you're just dragging the web grid to whatever pages you need it, and you don't care about any of this other implementation details back here. All you care about is implementing these 2 event handlers to know when something changed and calling the appropriate methods that are declared for the API for adding values, for getting the text, or for getting a pop-up value. And of course, you control what you want for your API if you're building your own controls. So generally speaking, you're only going to want to put in here what you need for whatever application it is you're building, unless you happen to be thinking, oh, this is a great idea. I might want to build a control I can sell to people or make available to people or whatever. And in which case, when you start building stuff like that, you need to think a little bit more generically. And probably you're going to want to add access to everything that you can think of so that people can use this in ways that you may not even have thought of. But for your own apps, you want to start with just what you need and add more things later. So I don't know if we have any questions on this particular control. And again, like this, which was the last project we looked at, that was the combo box and the navigator. Yes, the combo box, navigator, and this web grid container will be included in Xojo Release 3 along with all the other examples. So you'll have these to play around with and modify or whatnot. I think I may still have a little bit of commenting and whatnot I want to add to them so they're a little clearer. But I will also make these available with the recording when that's put up within the next week or so. So are there any questions about web containers, any of the specific examples, any general questions about web containers that maybe I didn't touch on that you might want to ask about? Now is the time. Looking at my time here, looks like we got about 10 minutes left, so I can certainly have some time to answer any questions that you might have. And while waiting, if people have questions, we can play around with this little project here and see again how it works. And this works for any number, of course. They could put, 400 in there, wouldn't really care. Hey, you see these are all independent. Well, I don't see much in the way of questions about any of this stuff, so I will assume that I explained everything perfectly and there's no possible questions that anyone could ask. But more likely people are just wanting to take some time to jump into the examples and dig around and see how they work. Next week's webinar is a general Q&A webinar. So pretty much open-ended, like we did in July. I'll take whatever questions people have about anything Xojo related, answer what I can, dive into specifics, maybe refer to examples or documentation as necessary. But that webinar is pretty darn open-ended, so that's a pretty popular one. So definitely you want to check out that one. And like I said, this recording will be made available probably within the week, along with the examples. I want to thank everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your day. Someone is asking me what's the proper way to pronounce Xojo, and it is pronounced Xojo, almost as if it started with a Z, at least for English speakers. So we pronounce it Xojo, but we are aware that other languages, that can be a tricky word to say, so go with what sounds best for you, but we like Xojo.